South Africa's economy is flatlining. How do we kickstart economic growth and investment to ensure that we can achieve higher and sustainable levels of economic growth? Well, joining me on the podcast is Dawie Roodt. He is a well-known economic commentator and also a director at the Efficient Group. Dawie Roodt, welcome to Solutions with David Ansara. Could we start off with an assessment of South Africa's economy today and why it is failing to achieve meaningfully high levels of economic growth?
Well, as an economist, I can give you a long list of reasons why the economy is not growing. Labor legislation, lack of electricity, lack of investments, and so on and so on and so on. The list simply goes on. But, I don't think that's the real answer. The real answer is we have to find out and see if we can understand why all these things are happening. Why don't we have enough electricity? Why don't we have enough investment in the country? Why do we have high levels of unemployment and things like that? And I think the answer to that is the ANC government. And I think the ANC government and everything that goes with that is the reason for all of this. It is because of cadre deployment. It is because of all the other silly policies or lack of policies quite often that we have things like, for example, total very low levels of confidence in the South African economy, low levels of confidence in government, uncertainty as far as policy is concerned. Because of cadre deployment, we don't have enough electricity. Because of the Tripartite Alliance and the influence of COSATU in the Tripartite Alliance, we've got labor legislation that's making it extremely difficult to employ people. And the list goes on and the list goes on. So I don't think really we've got economic issues in South Africa. It's easy to get to pinpoint all the economic problems that we have and to get solutions. The problem is not, that's not the issue. The issue, I believe, is political. So if you ask me what went wrong, I think my answer is the ANC government happened to South Africa. That's what went wrong.
Okay, and there's a long list of harmful policies. The EWC debate is raging in Parliament at the moment. We have discussions around putting NHI onto the table, national health insurance, which would crowd out private health insurance providers. There's also increasingly kind of hostile protectionist policies that are, putting up a lot of trade barriers around South Africa. But these all have their roots in a kind of an ideological worldview that is basically pretty hostile to business and investment, Dawie.
Very much so. We've got they like to use the word developmental state. The ANC wants to create a so-called developmental state in South Africa. A developmental state is just a double speak for what we call socialist or state interventionist kind of policies. You mentioned a few. And because of all these developmental stuff happening in South Africa, the fiscals in South Africa, the fiscal finances have become completely and totally unsustainable. So the state debt levels are at record high levels, for instance, which keep on going up at an alarming rate. And yet, despite that, they still want to implement things like, for example, the NHI or a super kind of fund, or expand the various grants or implement the basic income grants and things like that. I don't know where the money is going to come from. But because of all these developmental stuff and this idea of a developmental state, we've reached a point where we simply cannot go on, that the fiscal accounts have become unsustainable. And now they're trying to get more money in. They're trying to increase taxes because they want to spend even more on this so-called developmental issues, like the ones that I've mentioned and the ones that you've mentioned. Now, so yes, there's a significant ideological drive behind that. And on top of all of that, we've got cadre deployment and this whole ANC and the tripartite patronage that is essentially feeding off the state. So although they use all these ideological words and things, we have to remember it's not only ideology, but it's simply the nature of the ANC and the Tripartite Alliance, which position themselves in such a way that they pretty much live off the state today, and they call it a developmental state. Something that's caused immense damage to the South African economy in the last couple of years, and it will continue to do so in future.
Yeah, Dawie, and this idea of the developmental state is imported from places like Korea or Singapore, but South Africa simply doesn't have the civil service that many of these countries had, the same culture of accountability as well. And so I think one of the temptations that many development theorists that they have is they see models that may have worked in other countries, but which are completely different to the context and the political makeup of a country like our own.
Without a doubt, yes. But we've got an additional problem in South Africa because of all these wrong policies. And because of the wrong policies, especially the past 2 years, we've seen a huge increase in unemployment and poverty in South Africa. And that means that even more people are dependent on the state today. And according to my calculations, approximately 30 million people receive an income from the state every month. There's simply not enough money to keep on paying that 30 million an income every month, and it's inevitable that the income will come under pressure over the next couple of months and years because the economy simply cannot afford this anymore. So that's an excellent example where the state wants to be developmental or supportive and create a social security net, and even that social security net is unsustainable. So trying to do even more is just simply impossible. We've reached a point now where I can't afford even what we have, and there's no way that we introduce other things like, for example, a basic income grant or health insurance or whatever list of other things that they have in mind to implement as well.
And Dawie, you mentioned earlier the Tripartite Alliance. Obviously, one of the key pillars of that alliance is organized labor in the form of COSATU. And the biggest reflection or manifestation of COSATU's influence on policy is in the labor regulatory framework. So we have a number of laws like the Basic Conditions of Employment Act, the Labor Relations Act, the National Minimum Wage Act, all of which constrain the labor market and make it increasingly difficult for employers to take a risk on new employees. And the result is that many millions of people are without work. What role do you think the Tripartite Alliance plays in creating some of these bad policies?
Yeah, and there are many contradictions as well. Yeah, the Tripartite Alliance consisting of the ANC, COSATU, and the South African Communist Party. And each one of these members have a specific role to play. The ANC is the big brother, the senior partner. COSATU is supposed to be represent organized labor, and they were instrumental in introducing many of these legislations and laws that is making it extremely difficult to employ people in South Africa. And the South African Communist Party, of course, are the ideologues supposed to be. They provide the ideological base for the Tripartite Alliance. But I mentioned there are many contradictions here, and there are. For instance, currently we've got an extra grant of 350 Rand per month, which is far less than what that person would have earned if he earned the minimum wage, for example. So the state itself is paying somebody far less than the minimum wage according to legislation, and the state doesn't want the private sector to pay that minimum wage. So it doesn't make logical sense. Why on earth don't you allow the private sector to take off some of your expenditure from your income statement or your spending side of your budget? That's one example thereof. There are so many other examples as well. I mean, the ANC itself can't pay its own employees at the moment. And that actually we should be talking about taxes as well, because basically the ANC is taking the lead when it comes to a tax boycott, because according to newspaper reports, they owe something like 900 billion Rand to SARS. And there's another contradiction. SARS is talking about tightening the tax net and trying to introduce all sorts of measures to get tax evaders into the tax net. But at the same time, the ruling party is evading taxes. Those are the kind of contradictions that we see. We see it in labor, we see it in taxes, we see it everywhere. The ANC is preaching to everybody, or the Tripartite Alliance, they are preaching to everybody. But when it comes to actually leading by example, then they're far behind. They do not take the lead. They want us to pay minimum taxes. They want us to employ people, and they want us to employ people at unrealistic wages, but they do exactly the opposite. For example, there are so many contradictions. We've got a government that really and truly ran out of ideas.
And in addition to running out of ideas, the government's also running out of money, as you mentioned earlier. Yeah. And we're recording on the 20th of September, Dawie, but next month, at the end of October, is going to be the medium-term budget policy statement. And we have a new finance minister who will be delivering that speech for the first time, Enoch Kononqwana. So what is your reflection on his kind of political heft in comparison to his predecessor, Tito Mboweni? What are your thoughts on the new finance minister?
Yeah, it's always a relative thing. Tito Mboweni, I think, was the best that the ANC could could get at that time. He was there, and it was an open secret. He was keeping the chair warm for somebody else. I liked Titu, a bit of a maverick. He wasn't really in any of those existing camps in ANC. He was a kind of a lone ranger in his own way, with his tweets and his cooking and all that. He was a bit of a it was a lot of fun following Titu Mboweni. A nice guy. I liked him. I also liked his background, being the governor of the South African Reserve Bank for quite some time, and he's got a lot of experience. He was a good guy for the time being, but clearly his heart was not in it. Then the new Minister of Finance, Enoch Mngongwa, he was appointed. It wasn't really a surprise. I think it's again a good choice within amongst the cadres of the ANC. He's probably the best. He's been around for some time. He understands the ANC. He understands the policies or the lack thereof. And I think he can be seen as a conservative kind of Minister of Finance. I like the things that he said so far. Of course, if I have my choice, I will perhaps appoint somebody else, because I don't like the policies of the ANC. But given the political realities that we have in South Africa, he's probably the best guy for the job at the moment. There's only this one issue, this little skeleton in the cupboard that we are all aware of, and having a Minister of Finance with a financial skeleton in his cupboard is not a good thing. But apart from that, I think he's probably the best that the ANC can offer at this stage. But there are tremendous challenges waiting for him. We're waiting for the medium-term budget policy statement of the minister, and to see what things are going to look like. Maybe I should just make a side note here, in that the state finances are actually doing a little bit better than what we thought, say, only a few months ago. And the reason for that is because of this export bonanza and all the additional taxes that are being collected because of that. So for now, things look a little bit better. And that is perhaps a little bit unfortunate, because we know the ANC, whenever there's an opportunity to increase spending, they do that. And this extra bit of bonanza in the form of additional tax receipts that we're getting at the moment, some of that has already been spent on the basic income grant or the extension of this additional grant until February next year or so. So yeah, I'm a bit worried about that. The biggest challenge of the Minister of Finance will be to get his colleagues to support him and his ideas. And some of his ideas, very clearly, is not aligned with the ideas of some of the other colleagues in cabinet.
So Dawie, unlike Mr. Mboweni, Mr. Godongwana has perhaps a bit more political backing within the alliance, which might give him the political capital and the leverage to perhaps rein in spending. But of course, this commodities bonanza may not last for very long. These things are cyclical, and the problem is you don't want to entrench existing programs that might be a longer term liability. I think, as Milton Friedman once said, there's nothing so permanent as a temporary government program. So, I think the challenge there will be also making sure that there are enough savings for that inevitable rainy day.
Yeah. And what is, there is a small window of opportunity for the new Minister of Finance. If he really sticks to his guns and he keeps on cutting back on state spending like the way that they're planning to do. And I mentioned earlier that it's become inevitable that this 30 million people that depend on the state for an income, the income will fall in real terms over the next couple of years. That's the plan, but that's also part of the reality. So I think it's a small window of opportunity for him to cut back on state spending. Whether he will be able to do that or not, of course, is a different question. But I just want to touch on a word that Kusatu likes to use, and many other leftish analysts, and that's the word of austerity. We've got an austere budget, they say, which of course is absolute and total nonsense. We do not have an austere budget. The fiscal deficit in this financial year is probably going to be in the region of about 8% of GDP, and economic growth this year is going to be quite good for various reasons, statistical reasons, many of those reasons. But to talk about the fiscal deficit of 8% to GDP and call it an austere budget, it's very, very far off the mark. This is not an austere budget. This is a highly expansionary budget, exactly that we had last year, and the same that we're going to have next year. The only difference is that this year economic growth is going to be quite nice. Next year economic growth is going to start slowing down, and eventually we will move down to economic growth rate of around about 1.5%, 2% if we are lucky. But to talk about an austerity, when you talk about the fiscal deficit of 8%, simply, is completely wrong and incorrect.
But there are two ways of getting yourself out of that deficit. The one way is to cut your way out through austerity measures, but the other way is to grow your way out. And in many respects, the growth is easier if you have the right policies. And some of those policies are also cost-free. So the government likes to talk about huge, massive spending allocations on infrastructure, for example. But merely by removing EWC from the table, you would send a very strong signal to investors, to the broader economic community, that you're more serious about growth. So myself and my colleagues have long advocated for that, rather push for growth than trying the politically more tricky task of cutting spending and then risking getting kind of political blowback in the form of union pressure, for example.
Yeah, certainly. No, that's the right approach. It will be to get the economy to grow again, but for the reasons that we've mentioned already, I don't think we're going to see strong economic growth, sustainable growth in South Africa until we change the way that we are implementing certain policies in South Africa. But just by the way, David, there are two other ways of also getting out of your debt spiral. The one is by increasing taxes, and that's exactly what SARS is trying to do. And the other one is to get out of your debt spiral by letting inflation run amok. And I have a suspicion is that the Reserve Bank will come under pressure again when they start tightening monetary policy. And people quite often misunderstand or underestimate the effect of inflation on debt. Remember, one definition for inflation is that it erodes the value of money, but it also erodes the value of debt. And that is exactly what I think is going to happen. Within a year or two, three, once you've run out of taxpayers, and once you've run out of taxpayers' savings, and once you've run out of other sources of revenue, then the pressure on the Reserve Bank will start building up again and trying to force the Reserve Bank to create easy money, which will lead to inflation, which will then erode debt in real terms as well. So yeah, you're right. Growth is a preferred way of getting out of debt. But I'm afraid if you want to grow the economy, then you have to make people angry, especially people that are very much protected in the current environment. And I'm referring specifically to unionized workers and, of course, to the civil servants and to many, many politicians. We cannot afford that anymore. We cannot afford to protect them anymore. We need to get other people to share in the wealth-creating capacity and possibilities of South Africa as well. And I'm referring specifically to the poor and unemployed, because they essentially are prevented from taking jobs in South Africa because of things like, for example, minimum wages and the like. But yeah, that's the way to go, is to grow the economy. But I'm afraid with what we have currently, that is unlikely to be on top of the agenda quite soon.
So Dawie, this is the Solutions podcast. So let's try together to come up with some novel ideas to solve some of these problems. So imagine you've been appointed the finance minister, there's been a change in government. Where do you start? What are some of your first policies that you will put on the table?
Yeah, well, that's easy, David. What I will do, I will get rid of things like, for example, minimum wages. And I'm very much in favor of labor organizing themselves in a collective. I'm not against labor unions, but minimum wages is just not acceptable. You cannot allow you and somebody else to go into some sort of agreement which includes me without me having a say in that. It's just immoral. It's completely wrong. So that's the kind of things that I will change in labor legislation, and that is that allow different labor organizations to enter into agreement with the employees as they see fit, and don't enforce some minimum wages or certain minimum conditions apart from absolute minimal conditions on somebody that's not part of that agreement. So that is one thing that I certainly will change, and that's on labor. Many other things that will change, I will remember and I will remind politicians that the primary function of the state is to look after people, make sure people are safe, and to look after their stuff. And things like, for example, expropriation is nothing but stealing people's property. And that is the role of the state, to protect people's property. So get rid of that. You cannot do that. Something else is you cannot decide for businesses who they want to employ. This idea of BEE must be abolished. We have to get rid of that. Imagine a billionaire black individual can qualify for BEE, but a poor white individual cannot qualify for some sort of special treatment. It's just simply wrong. As an economist that specializes in the fiscal accounts, there are many things that I will change in the tax as far as taxes are concerned, many other things that I will do in state spending that I will change. I will reduce the number of ministers. I will get rid of many state departments. Small business development, I will scratch that. Women, the Department of Women, I will get rid of that. The Department of Sport, I will cancel that immediately. Just think to yourself, what does the Minister of Sport, what does he do? What does he do? Does he sit and watch TV the whole day or what? Those are the kind of things that I will do. I will also cut back on the wage bill. There are simply too many civil servants. They are not very productive. I will privatize wherever I can. And just by the way, we are actually in the process of privatizing a lot of things in South Africa. We have privatized the police force. There are 3 times as many private sector security people out there as policemen out there, and people just don't trust the police. Many surveys tell this to us. So we are actually going through a process of privatization of many things, including even the police. But I will privatize or close down things like Eskom, South African Airways, the NEL. I don't know how you're going to privatize the NEL because nobody would buy it. South African Airways, for example, I know there's apparently a buyer for South African Airways. I don't really believe that. So I want to see if they're really going to put money into that thing. You must be a little bit crazy if you want to put money into South African Airways. So those are the kind of things that I will do. But again, the answers to our economic woes are easy. We know what to do. You can just ask. You don't need somebody with a PhD in economics to give you an answer on these sort of things. We know what the answers are. But the question really is politics. Is how are we going to get around politicians? The current ANC and a Tripartite Alliance, which are basically in charge of economic policy in South Africa, how are we going to convince them to start implementing the right policies to get this economy to grow again? So my approach is that where I sit, is that I advise my clients to do certain things, and we can talk about that. And I try to be pragmatic, and I try to sort of see if I can put measures in place to protect the assets of my clients, and see what we can do under very, very difficult circumstances to still be able to generate an income in South Africa and still be able to do business in South Africa, despite all this hostility and all this policy uncertainty and everything that comes from government, which makes it extremely difficult to do business in South Africa.
So Dawie, I mean, I asked the previous question, and what we've really focused on is the kind of macro level, the decisions around policymakers. But for many people watching or listening to this show, they might think, well, I don't have political power. I don't have a strong voice. What am I supposed to do about these broad trends that are kind of beyond my control, or seemingly beyond my control? So what would you advise ordinary South Africans to do, particularly in terms of protecting their sources of income and also their savings? Because we had Frans Cronje on the show talking about the way in which you can develop a plan B, and one of those aspects was protecting your income and maybe diversifying your sources of income. We also had Magnus Haystack on the show talking about why you should offshore your savings. So maybe we could focus on those 2 themes, starting with your income sources.
Yeah, well, okay, let's just start off by looking at how economies are evolving. And economies, I mean, if you go back to 100 years ago and compare economies of 100 years ago to what we have today, there are huge differences. 100 years ago, most economic activity happens either in agriculture or in mining, at least in South Africa, but many other places in the world as well, including the biggest economy in the world, the United States. Most people work in agriculture. Now, that is completely different today. Today, you will find that the primary sectors are much, much smaller. Even the tertiary sectors are much, much smaller. And the real growth is happening in the service industry and the tertiary sector. Did I say tertiary? The secondary sector is also even smaller, relatively speaking, but it's the tertiary sector, the advanced side of the economy, the modern economy. That is where economic growth is taking place. And this is what we are doing now, you and I. We're talking via this amazing new technology. And there are many reasons why that is happening. Because of technology, but because also people got the necessary skills and many other things that are happening. The world is just the most amazing place, and the progress we are making. So keep that in mind all the time. And that, maybe another side note, is why expropriation is such a silly idea, because politicians think that you create value because you have a piece of land. That's not where value is created. Value is created in a lab. It's created in a university, the real value. And they've forgotten about that. They've forgotten that you don't even know where I'm sitting right now, but I can be anywhere in the world. That's an example where our technology is changing our lives. Okay, with that kind of background, how do you position yourself? And before I get to that, maybe also the comment is that there are so many opportunities in South Africa. All you need to do is just think a little bit what the state is supposed to be doing. We've spoken about this. The state is supposed to look after law and order in the country. They failed miserably, and there's an opportunity. So just see what the state is supposed to be doing and go and do that. And see what happened the past 2 years in education. I mean, we've got 2 small kids. They are still at school. And the possibilities of education because of the internet and the tools, everything that is available, that is just a huge opportunity there. And again, the state is failing our poor kids mostly because of the horrible education that we're providing. Infrastructure is another very good example. The state is not providing the infrastructure, but some people would argue that they should be doing. So there, what you should be doing, look what the state is supposed to be doing and do that. So that's one first step. The second step is be aware of what's going on. So I tell people, be aware of what's going on. Listen to David Ansara and his podcasts, and try to identify those risks that you could potentially face in your specific industry. Now, for example, agriculture, there's a lot of political risks in agriculture. So once you've identified the risks, then put measures in place to try to mitigate those risks. And a good example in agriculture is, for example, is put your assets in one company, the farm in one company, and put the business in another company. So the operations in another company. And that's the part of where I'm trying to be pragmatic here. So if you need to do BEE things, do it in the operations company, not in your property company, and put agreements between these 2 companies in place. If you can, gear your property. So get the bank to take risk with you. Go and borrow against that properties. If it's possible, and it's completely and totally legal, get a foreigner, and the foreigner could be your company registered in another country. Get a foreigner to take a stake in your local business as well. And because of that, you've got international agreements that also protect you now. So there are examples. Of course, you will never get rid of all the risks, but there are examples how you can mitigate some of these risks. So make your money in South Africa. There are many opportunities, but make sure you take a substantial portion of your money abroad. And again, there are many opportunities how you can do that. And there are many risks. Be aware of the risks. The most important risk is that know who you are doing business with. There are many crooks out there. Make sure that you pick the right partner to assist you and advise you on how to take your money out of the country. Second risk is that make sure you've got the right kind of structures. Because some of these structures can be extremely expensive. They are legal. There are various structures available that's legal. But make sure you have the right kind of structures, and you can use these kind of structures to externalize some of your assets as well. For example, get somebody else, an international guy, to do your marketing of your exports and paying for that, for example. So that's one way of externalizing, completely and totally legal, some of your assets. So once you've got the structures in place, remember there are other risks, like, for example, normal market risks. Markets go up and down. Make sure you invest in the right kind of assets. Get the necessary advice. Make sure you revise everything every now and again, and so on. So that's the approach that we follow with our clients, and it's not easy. I can tell you is that SARS is always on the lookout to take an extra bite out of the assets of our clients. Many people come to me, and I know we've got the responsibilities as companies in the financial services sector to do things like, for example, know your client and to report any wrongdoings, and we indeed do that. But many people come to me, and I have not, and I've been in this business for many years, I have not come across one single individual telling me he's involved in drugs and he wants to launder his drug money. I've not come across one single individual that wants to send money to a terrorist organization, for example. Not one single one. But I can tell you, each and everyone that walks into my office tells me they want to pay as little tax as possible. So I'm afraid all this legislation that we have today, the politicians are trying to convince us they're doing that for our own protection. But of course, the real reason is they want to get even more taxes out of us. And in fact, recently, SARS indicated that they're going to make life even more difficult for taxpayers and see if they can get even more money out of us. So I think be pragmatic, make sure you have the necessary skills to participate in this wonderful new economy. Make sure that you have the necessary hardware, like a proper camera or a computer, whatever, and make sure that you have a connection, because that's where the new economy is happening. And it doesn't matter where you are. You can be in South Africa or you can be anywhere else and understand what's going on and try to mitigate your risks as far as you possibly can. There are exciting and wonderful opportunities out there. And I can promise you, David, it doesn't matter what the politicians throw at us, we will always be 1 or 2 steps ahead.
And Dawie, just in terms of tax, I mean, I think a lot of people are also leaving the country in terms of emigrating and taking a lot of their savings with them. So there's a kind of a de facto tax revolt that's happening.
Yeah.
I guess that would act as a form of pressure on the government that, yes, maybe there has been a recent boom in terms of the commodity super cycle and some improvements in rents coming from that. But, ultimately still individuals carry the burden of the state's tax expenses. So, with more of them leaving or offshoring, there might be some breaking point down the line for the government.
No, without a doubt. In fact, we all know the numbers, but the fiscus in South Africa is perhaps the most redistributive fiscus in the world, which basically means that the guys paying the taxes are not the guys getting the benefits from the state. That's basically what it means. And the South African fiscus is exceptionally redistributive at all levels, on the revenue side, on the tax side, as well as on the spending side. And I think that's part of the reason why we haven't seen recently further increases in taxes, because the politicians realize that we've reached past that point where you can get more money out of the system by increasing taxes. And the obvious next step is to try to close the loopholes and try to force people to pay the existing already very high levels of taxes in South Africa. And you're absolutely right, there's a low-level tax revolt already going on at various levels. The best example is perhaps the toll road. So people are just not paying tolls. But there are other ways through which we can, and again, the irony here is that the ANC is allegedly, the ANC is showing us the way here because they're also not paying their taxes over to SARS. But there are other ways that you can do that by not flying South African Airways, by putting up a solar system on the roof of your house. You're not paying money to Eskom. That's a way of a kind of a tax. So that kind of things are people doing all the time, and they're making use of legal loopholes, and they still are, or legal structures and legal opportunities. There still are quite a number of those. And I encourage people to do that. I do not encourage people to break the law, but I certainly do encourage people to pay as little tax as possible without breaking the law anyway. And people are doing that. We can see it in all sorts of numbers. And I'm afraid, David, if they keep on spending the way that they have been spending the last couple of years, and they're planning to keep on spending like what they're telling us they're going to do on the NHI and all these other things that they're planning to do, then I'm afraid the taxpayers are simply going to go away, and they're going to create wealth somewhere else in the world. They're going to employ people somewhere else in the world, and we are running out of taxpayers. And when that happens, I'm afraid even the political future of South Africa could be in doubt. It's quite possible that South Africa can fall apart politically as well. Maybe I can just give you an example of what I mean by that. I had a farmer that was a client, and this farmer, a very wealthy farmer, exported to Europe. He and his family worked on the farm, and he simply said, listen, he's sick and tired of all these threats, and he sold his farm in South Africa, and they moved to another country. They moved to Australia. So, and it took him a couple of years to set up in Australia. He and his family and some of his workers and his sons and even some of his implements, he took over to Australia. He developed a number of farms in Australia, and they all emigrated, they all moved there, and they started exporting recently to exactly the same customers in Europe. So this guy, for all practical purposes, exported his farm. Everything that matters on that farm has been exported except the land itself. The know-how has been exported. The clients are the same. The workers are the same. The technology is the same. Everything is the same. except the land is not being used in South Africa, is being used in Australia. Now, that's an example where a farmer exported his farm, and more people are exporting their farms and their factories and their businesses in exactly the same manner.
So now, Dawie, in our discussion with Magnus Haystack, we were looking at the relative performance of the JSE against other equities markets, and he was saying that there's a strong case for investing offshore. But now, if you look at the global financial system, since the Great Recession in 2008, the world has been kind of propped up by stimulus spending. Central banks from the US Federal Reserve, the ECB in Europe, the Bank of England, all kept interest rates very low. They've pumped liquidity into capital markets. And, this party might end pretty soon in a pretty disastrous way. Do you not think that there's a risk that South African investors could get in too late and incur huge losses through that process?
No, without a doubt. I think I'm very concerned about the international financial markets. The markets are red hot because of the things that you've mentioned. Things like an exceptionally stimulatory fiscal and monetary stance internationally. So all of that, of course, is pushing up the equity prices and bond prices to very, very high levels. So I'm concerned about a global recession, because eventually inflation could become a problem. I say could because I'm not convinced it is going to become a problem. And that will lead to all sort of corrections on the financial markets. So I'm afraid, yes, you're right, that there is a possibility. There's a possibility of all these sort of things happening, and that certainly is a risk. But maybe let me give you a bit of a different take on this. I did mention a few minutes ago that while economies evolved and the growth is taking place in the tertiary part of economies today. And I have a suspicion that world economic growth and the size of the world economy, including the South African economy, by the way, is perhaps bigger than what we think. And let me tell you why. Because let me give you one example. The act of Googling has value in it. There's a paper that I read about that, and the value to an individual of Googling, which is free, by the way, is approximately $500 annually for an American. But that number is not captured anywhere in economic statistics. And there are many other examples. The so-called gig economy, things that's happening with Ubering, all these, fancy developments, and fintech. I like fintech is a very good example of that. All those sort of economic activities are not captured anywhere in official economic statistics and data. And I've got a suspicion that the world economy could be bigger and could be growing much faster than what we think. If that is indeed the case, then inflation is not going to be a problem. And then it won't be necessary to tighten monetary policy. And we could see the world financial markets staying on this bull run for many, many years still to come. Maybe there's a couple of bumps in the road here and there. But I am actually quite optimistic about future economic growth, because I think what we're seeing now is a similar kind of development to what we saw when the internet became more widely used. It's a similar kind of development that we saw when electricity became more widely used, and many other examples. So I think that is what's happening now, and we still don't know what the impact of that is going to be in the world economy. It's going to be huge. It is huge, and I think it's going to be hugely positive, and I think we underestimate that completely and totally. So yeah, there is a possibility, because of the reasons you've mentioned, looking at the normal way of analyzing the economy, that we can go through significant corrections internationally. And by the way, I think we are going to go through significant corrections because of excessive fiscal and monetary stimulation internationally. But I think we don't know enough. There's something else going on as well, and that's probably mostly good news.
Dawie, a few months ago, we had Rob Price on the channel talking about unsound money and the risks of that, basically referring to many of the stimulatory pressures that we've discussed today. And the opposite of that is sound money, which he believes comes in the form of cryptocurrencies, and specifically Bitcoin. On the other hand, we had Magnus Haystack. He was quite skeptical of digital currencies. Where do you fall on this debate?
No, I actually am very excited about these so-called, they call it cryptocurrencies. I don't like to call it cryptocurrency. I prefer to call it private monies. But there's much more than only Bitcoin. There's decentralized financing happening at the moment, where you can enter into all sort of agreement with people. You can actually conduct your finances on the internet, making use of wonderful software. This is the Wild West still. There's a lot of uncertainty. I'm not telling people go and put all your money in Bitcoin. That's certainly not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is that there's a revolution happening in the financial industry and in many other industries. This revolution is going to put a lot more power in the hands of individuals. This revolution is going to reduce costs dramatically. It has done so already. And certain institutions, like, for example, banks, could certainly, the way that we understand banking is probably going to disappear as well. So there's a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of things happening out there, but I am super, super excited about these new developments. And private currencies is going to be part of that. And if you don't like a private currency because there's nothing behind that, then why do you like something like the dollar or the rand or the yen? Because there's nothing behind that either. And in fact, the guys issuing the rand or the dollar or the yen or the euro or whatever, the central banks of the world, they are issuing currencies, their various currencies, and they tell you in so many words, they want this currency to lose value. They tell you that. It's called inflation targeting. Inflation targeting means that I want my currency to lose value. So my goodness gracious, who are you going to give your money to? To somebody that actually promises you and tells you, I'm going to undermine the value of your currency, or give it to some new venture where people say, listen, this is new technology, let's try it out. But I must warn people, there are a lot of crooks out there that's going to steal your money and your passwords and stuff like that. Be extremely careful, but stay on top of things. Find out what is going on. And I think it's going to be really super exciting what's going to happen. And I think certainly private currency is going to be part of all of this new developments.
So, Dawie, do you have any final words for our listeners and how they might be able to navigate through some of this uncertainty that you've described?
Yeah, well, last words for your listeners. The one is a practical advice, if I may. And I always, you can compare it to getting into an airplane when you could still fly or regularly. And they will always tell you to look after yourself and put your oxygen mask on your own face before you look after the kids. So that's one piece of practical advice to everybody, that you cannot look after anybody else if you don't first of all look after yourself. Your first responsibility is with yourself. And then on a slightly different, more of a philosophical note, and that is that I advise people, and this is something I learned far too late in my life, but my advice to people is to try to do stuff that you don't think you will be able to do, and you will be amazed on what you actually can achieve and what you can do. So try things that you can do, and you will be amazed at what you actually can do.
Dawie Roodt, thank you very much for joining me on Solutions with David Ansara. If you're watching on YouTube, please do give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. And if you're listening on your preferred podcast platform, please do subscribe there as well, and also leave a 5-star review. That really helps the show to grow. My name is David Ansara. Until next week, take care.